Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time we are talking all about this crazy heat wave that hit South America back in February 2025.
Yeah, February is rough.
So we've got a bunch of articles and research on this, and one of the coolest pieces we have is this one from NASA Earth Observatory.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, they've got some incredible satellite imagery in there.
Yeah.
And just from glancing at that stuff, it looks like Rio de Janeiro really got hit hard.
Sure. But it wasn't just Brazil. You know, this heat wave, it stretched all the way down to Argentina.
Yeah, it seems like this thing really had a huge impact across a big area.
Yeah.
So let's dive into it and figure out what exactly happened.
That's good.
Okay, so one of the first things that jumped out to me from that NASA article was this weird high-pressure system that was hanging out over the South Atlantic. It just sat there for weeks in February. I'm picturing it like a big, heavy blanket of hot air just kind of smothering everything.
Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy.
Yeah.
High pressure systems, they kind of work like a lid on a pot. You know, the air sinks, compresses, and then all the heat gets trapped underneath. Ah, okay, I see. So all that sinking air just gets hotter and hotter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you throw in, the existing climate patterns that are already in play, and boom, you've got a recipe for some seriously intense heat.
And that's exactly what happened here. So how did this all play out in a place like Rio de Janeiro? I mean, they're used to warm weather, but this heat wave was something else, right?
Oh yeah, it was off the charts. They hit a record-breaking 44 degrees Celsius in Guaratiba.
Wait, 44 degrees Celsius? What is that in Fahrenheit?
That's like 111 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow, that's just brutal.
It's the highest temperature they've ever recorded since they set up their climate alert system.
Yeah, that says something, right? And it wasn't just Guaratiba, right? I mean, the article mentioned a bunch of other places, too.
Yeah, it was widespread. The whole region was baking.
Like Silva Jardim, they hit 42 degrees Celsius.
Yep, and schools had to push back their opening dates. People were just flocking to the beaches, desperately trying to cool off. And hospitals saw a spike in heat-related illnesses.
So this thing really messed with people's lives.
It definitely disrupted things.
The article also mentioned that 6 Argentine provinces were put under a red alert for extreme heat by the end of February. What exactly does a red alert mean for people? I mean, in terms of like what they need to do and how seriously they need to take it.
A red alert, it's basically a big flashing warning sign saying things are getting really dangerous.
Yeah.
It's a serious situation, could be life-threatening. In this case, they were mainly worried about heat exhaustion and heat stroke, especially for, vulnerable folks like older people and young kids.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So they probably issued all sorts of public health advisories,
Yeah.
opened up cooling centers, and made sure that emergency services were, ready for anything.
So it sounds like this heat wave was a double whammy. We had those record-breaking temperatures causing chaos in places like Rio, and then it spreads south and triggers this whole health crisis in Argentina.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And we have to remember that those are just like 2 snapshots of what was happening, We need to zoom out and look at those satellite images to really grasp the full scale of this thing.
I agree. The article mentions a heat map from February 17th. I think it would be really helpful for our listeners to try and visualize that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you mentioned this heat map was generated using satellite data and the GUS model. Can you break down what that GUS model is for us? I mean, in simple terms, what exactly does it do?
Okay, so think about how we use weather forecasts, right, to figure out, what the temperature is going to be like tomorrow.
Yeah.
Well, the GEOS model does something kind of similar, but on a much bigger scale and with way more detail.
So it's like a super-powered weather forecast?
Yeah, basically.
Ah.
It uses all these complex mathematical equations to simulate what's happening in the atmosphere.
Oh, wow. So instead of just predicting tomorrow's temperature, it's helping us understand this whole heat wave, how it formed, how it moved, all that stuff.
Right. And by running these simulations, scientists can create those super detailed visualizations like that heat map you mentioned.
So that heat map, it's not just some random graphic. It's based on hard data and complex calculations.
Exactly. It paints a clear picture of, how far the heat wave spread and how temperatures varied across different areas.
And this is where things get really interesting, because if you look at that map, it's not just this uniform blanket of heat.
Right, it's patchy.
Yeah, you can see these distinct hot zones and how they shifted over time.
It wasn't static.
Yeah.
It ebbed and flowed, intensifying in some areas while easing up in others.
And you can clearly see that southward progression. The intense heat that started in Brazil eventually moved down into Argentina.
Yeah, and that's a key takeaway here. This heat wave, it didn't just stay put in one spot. It shows how these extreme weather events can have these ripple effects across huge distances, impacting multiple regions and countries.
And we know that these extreme weather events are only becoming more common and more intense globally, so what happened in South America could be a preview of what's to come in other parts of the world.
It's a wake-up call for sure. This heat wave, it's a microcosm of what we're facing in a warming world. It's a reminder that climate change is not some future problem. It's here, it's happening now, and it's impacting people and ecosystems all over the planet. And, it's scary to think about how these intense heat waves mess with cities. I mean, cities are already kind of like heat traps. Right?
Yeah, what is it called? Urban heat islands or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Urban heat islands. It's like if you're driving, from out in the country where there's lots of trees and open fields, and then you drive into a city center, you can actually feel the temperature difference.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Cities with all that concrete and asphalt, they soak up a ton of heat during the day. And unlike, natural landscapes, they release that heat super slowly at night. So it creates this dome of warm air that just hangs over the city.
So it's like the city itself becomes this giant radiator.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And during a heat wave like the one we saw in South America,
yeah,
that effect gets amplified like crazy. It's not good.
Yeah, it's like adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
And then you factor in the lack of trees and plants in a lot of urban areas.
Right. Trees help so much. They provide shade and release moisture, which cools things down.
Yeah.
But in a city made of concrete, there's not a lot of escape from that intense heat.
I bet that has some serious implications for people's health, especially during a heat wave that drags on for weeks.
Oh, absolutely. Heat stress can lead to all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
From like mild discomfort to really serious stuff like heat stroke.
Yeah, heat stroke is no joke.
And the people who are hit the hardest are the elderly young children and anyone with pre-existing health conditions.
Makes sense. I remember reading about how overwhelmed the hospitals in Brazil were during this heat wave, especially in Rio. Did Argentina see something similar?
Yeah, when that red alert went out in Argentina hospitals, they were bracing themselves for a huge influx of patients, especially in those 6 provinces that were hit the hardest.
He had to be ready.
Yeah, heat exhaustion and heat stroke can overload healthcare systems so fast if they're not prepared.
And it's not just the physical health impacts, right? I've read that extreme heat can really mess with people's mental well-being, too.
That's a really important point. Studies have shown that there's a link between heat waves and increased stress aggression, even higher crime rates. It makes sense. When you're uncomfortable and can't sleep because of the heat, it's going to affect your mood and how you act.
It's like this ripple effect. These high temperatures create all these cascading consequences that impact everything. It's pretty wild when you think about how interconnected everything is.
Totally.
Yeah.
And as climate change keeps getting worse, these interconnected consequences are going to become even more obvious and more severe.
So is there anything we can actually do to adapt to these more frequent and more intense heat waves?
Well, there's no magic bullet.
Mm-hmm.
But there are things we can do on different levels. One is urban planning. Designing cities with more green spaces, parks, and trees.
To help cool things down.
Exactly. Those act as natural cooling systems.
Mm.
We also need to start using more reflective materials in construction so buildings don't absorb as much heat.
So it's about rethinking how we design and build our cities. That's a pretty proactive approach to dealing with the urban heat island effect. What about in the short term? Like, how can we prepare for these extreme heat events when they happen?
Early warning systems are key. We need to give people accurate and timely information about heat waves so they can take precautions.
Right, so they have time to prepare.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And public health messaging is crucial too. We need to educate people about the risks of extreme heat and how to stay safe.
Like reminding people to stay hydrated, avoid strenuous activity during the hottest parts of the day, and know the signs of heat exhaustion. Basic stuff, but it can really make a difference.
Absolutely. And we need to ensure that everyone has access to cooling centers, especially those vulnerable populations. Those can literally save lives during extreme heat.
Okay, so we've talked about adapting to the heat, but let's circle back to the root cause for a second. The NASA article pointed to that unusual high-pressure system over the South Atlantic as a major driver of this heat wave. Can you unpack that a little more for us?
Sure. High-pressure systems are basically areas where the atmospheric pressure is higher than in the surrounding areas. It's like having a heavy weight pushing down on the atmosphere.
Okay.
That downward force makes the air sink.
So instead of rising, the air is sinking.
Right. And as it sinks, it gets compressed and warms up. That's why high-pressure systems usually bring clear skies and dry conditions.
So that explains why this heat wave was so intense and why it stuck around for so long. The sinking air just kept getting hotter and hotter. But was it just the high-pressure system, or were there other things going on? I mean, we keep hearing about how climate change is linked to extreme weather.
It's a great question, and it's complicated. It's not a simple cause and effect situation. It's more like a bunch of interconnected factors. Climate change is definitely part of the equation. As global temperatures rise, we're basically making these extreme heat events more likely to happen.
So climate change is making these high-pressure systems more likely to form and linger, which leads to more extreme heat.
Exactly. And it's not just about temperature. Climate change is also messing with precipitation patterns. In lots of parts of the world, we're seeing longer droughts, which just makes the effects of heat waves even worse.
That makes sense. Dry conditions plus intense heat. That's like the perfect recipe for those wildfires we see all the time.
For sure, dry vegetation goes up in flames so easily, and those hot, dry winds just fan the flames. It's a dangerous combo.
And then the wildfires release even more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which makes climate change worse. It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it's a feedback loop. Climate change makes these extreme events more likely, and then those events make climate change worse.
It's like a domino effect. And it's not just wildfires. We have to think about the impacts on ecosystems, too.
Right? Long periods of super high temperatures can really stress plants and animals. It can stunt their growth, mess with their ability to reproduce, and even kill them.
And that can screw up the whole food chain.
Exactly. If certain plants or animals die off, it throws the whole ecosystem out of whack. And then there's the impact on water resources. High temperatures increase evaporation, which can lower water levels in rivers, lakes, and reservoirs.
So less water for everyone.
And that can have huge consequences for agriculture industry and just everyday people trying to get the water they need.
So this isn't just about, feeling uncomfortable during a heat wave. This is about all these ripple effects that touch every part of our lives and the environment.
Exactly. We have to stop thinking about climate change as just a temperature problem. It's so much bigger than that. It affects every aspect of our planet and our lives.
Okay, so we've broken down the science behind this heat wave. We've talked about the devastating impacts and the urgent need for adaptation and mitigation strategies. But there's another layer to the story that I want to get into, and that's how we communicate about these events. We were talking about those satellite images and heat maps earlier. Those visuals are pretty powerful, right? You see South America just covered in red. It's like the whole continent is on fire. But I wonder if those images sometimes oversimplify things a bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Those heat maps are super useful for understanding the big picture, the scale and intensity of a heat wave. But they don't always show the whole story.
Right, because it wasn't like this uniform heat wave. Some areas got hit way harder than others, and the heat shifted around over time.
Exactly. A heat map can show you the general pattern, but it doesn't really tell you how different communities and ecosystems were affected. I mean, a region with a lot of forest cover is going to experience the heat differently than, say, a farming area.
So how do we balance the need to communicate how urgent climate change is with the need to accurately represent how complex these events really are?
That's a good question. I think it comes down to storytelling. We need to go beyond just throwing data and statistics at people.
We need to make it real for them.
Right. We need to connect those data points to actual lived experiences. Show how climate change is messing with people's lives, their jobs, their communities.
Put a human face on the data?
Exactly.
Yeah.
For example, instead of just saying that Rio hit 44 degrees Celsius, we could talk about how schools had to close down, how hospitals were overwhelmed, how people were desperate to cool off on the beaches.
And in Argentina, we could talk about the farmers struggling with drought, the families worried about running out of water, the communities dealing with the economic fallout of this heat wave.
Exactly. By weaving those stories into our understanding of the data, we create a much richer picture. We can show how climate change is hitting different regions, different industries, different aspects of our lives.
It's about making those connections, showing how climate change isn't some far-off threat. It's happening right here, right now. It's affecting all of us.
Absolutely. And by connecting the dots between global climate change and what's happening in our own backyards, we can empower people to actually do something about it.
Because ultimately, it's not just about understanding the science, it's about using that knowledge to make a difference.
Couldn't agree more. Knowledge without action is pointless.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on the South American heat wave, let's turn it over to our listeners. You've spent this time with us learning about this event. I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts swirling around. What's the biggest thing you're taking away from this? What are you going to do with this knowledge?
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the climate crisis.
Yeah.
It's a huge problem. But we have to remember that every action we take, no matter how small, can make a difference.
We can start by making changes in our own lives, reducing our carbon footprint, being more mindful of what we buy and how much we consume.
We can support organizations that are fighting climate change. We can push for policies that prioritize sustainability.
We can talk to our friends and family about these issues, raise awareness, get them involved.
This is a challenge we all face together, and it's going to take all of us working together to solve it. Every voice matters. Every action counts.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something and that you feel empowered to take action.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end here.
Yeah.
Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for change. Together, we can build a more sustainable future for everyone.
We'll see you next time.